Welcome to the 37th episode of Renegade Marketers Live, a show that promises to be long on marketing insights and short on overhyped buzzwords. We'll be drinking in the latest tactics and the coolest gin. Yep, this may be the only live marketing show that also features a gin tasting. This show is being live streamed via our friends at Restream, and if you want to drink along at home, today we're having a Tomcat fight and tasting Bar Hill Tomcat versus Gin Lane 1751 Old Tom Gin. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, live from my home studio in New York City. Today's episode is about the choices marketers make when budgeting. There are so many options, so many different ways to spend money on people, on tech, on media channels, on events, on swag, you name it. And the more options you choose, the harder it is to measure direct outcomes, particularly when the components impact your target in different ways. All of this begs the question, even more questions, like how do marketing budgets get built and how are the allocations determined? To get at these questions and more, we've got three marketing mix masters lined up to share their approaches and hard-earned wisdom. And of course, if you have any questions during this is a live show, ask away, and we'll see what we can do. Okay, with that, let's bring on Leigh Mackie, CMO of AvePoint. Hello, Leigh.
Hi, Drew. Happy to be here.
How are you? And first of all, where are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm actually currently visiting London in the UK. So y'all might can tell I'm not usually based here.
Yeah, you don't quite have that English clip. No.
Yeah, for a couple weeks. It was a nice excuse. I have a friend getting married just after the Easter weekend. And so it was a great time for me to come over and visit some of my team members here in our London office and visit some old friends, considering I've lived here for like 6 or 7 years as of just until last year. So always happy for an excuse to come across the pond.
Well, you're going to have
very
to
appropriate for gin tasting. So
well, perfect. And you're going to have to do also a rendition of I'm Getting Married in the Morning. I know it's not you, but you know, it is a song that was sung in London. And so you'll want that from My Fair Lady. Okay. So anyway, that's very cool. And our producer, Melissa, is in Ireland. So we have an international show going here. So for folks that are unfamiliar with AvePoint, can you give us like a 1-sentence summary?
Yes, absolutely. So AvePoint, we've been around for a long time, but we essentially are really excited to offer an integrated platform, a SaaS platform for ultimately SaaS and data management. And what that means is organizations that are heavily invested in Microsoft 365, using Microsoft Teams, even Salesforce, Google Workspace, can better migrate, manage, and protect their data to secure collaboration and optimize all their operations. So a lot of tech, a lot of cool tech, very critical to ultimately how we work today and making sure that we're all doing so safely and securely.
Okay, so let's just sort of, given that, I mean, we're in the software, it's a lot of businesses could use your services, primarily, as I recall, Microsoft shops, but talk about your targeting priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're B2B, B2B SaaS software for sure. And that's always interesting for us because, you know, Microsoft provides these great platforms that are highly customizable and can be highly tailored to organizations based on their industry. And they absolutely have different sort of programs that help communicate value to the different buyer personas or even user personas. And so it's interesting for us because coming from a tech shop, we very much started in that kind of back of house, supporting tech teams and technology teams that wanted to just better manage and migrate and protect data. Over the past several years, we've really evolved because technology spend, as we all know, is not just in the tech side of the house. business decision makers are actually dictating tech spend. And so for us, our targeting priorities have definitely expanded over the years. Ultimately, we know we've got to get that core tech audience, but we also now need to really appeal to multitude of buyer personas and even user personas that are ultimately going to be engaging with our technology and software as we go. So it's been interesting for sure. And especially now, like security is even more so top of mind as of late. And with that, we are able to just like respond very quickly and understand kind of where those priorities might lie. But it definitely keeps us on our toes as market changes, as the market shifts, and as we introduce new solutions into the market.
So given that, let's see, you've got tech people, you've got sort of business people in general,
teams and post-tech teams.
Right. And then you have the CISO, right? Those folks. Talk a little bit about marketing mix and, this broader kind of weird question that we're trying to tackle in this show. Yeah. What's your approach?
Yeah. So I think as with anything, we kind of want to start at the end. What are the targets and where do we see those targets really coming from? This is really where we'll bring in sort of the sales leaders, the folks acting as a CRO, and really talk about our corporate vision and goals. AvePoint listed last year on NASDAQ via SPAC. And so we have published a lot of those targets and we're able to essentially start there. And then we're kind of working backwards from the top down to understand where that might come from. Which regions where we exist, which product mixes and product lines are probably our best bets based on market trends and where we're seeing growth. And then we also have kind of the bottom up, right? Like in region, we have our field marketers, we have our sales teams, and they also want to make sure that they're filling their pipelines and looking at their pipeline coverage. So essentially we start at the end with the revenue mix, work backwards based on, conversion points and conversion rates and things like that, and are essentially doing that first allocation that way, just based on the kind of top down. I also try to stay a little bit up to speed and try to benchmark ourselves against what other technology providers, essentially product marketers, are doing. And I think the latest Gartner reports that I've read have said, pretty much thirds between people, technology, and programs. I've seen a lot of different data points. It always depends on which is technically, marketing technology versus sales technology. But I think those baselines are always a great place to start. And then obviously, if we are trying to break into a new market, if we have a high growth segment that we're trying to capture, that's always going to, merit a little shift, if you will.
Right, because you're going to need to invest more because you're not as well known in that area. But let's go back to the people, tech, and then just spend. If you do one third on that, you really only have a third of your budget going to something that is driving revenue. I wonder about that. It came up in a huddle, and first of all, technology wasn't, but it was sort of 50-50 people and spend, right? And they talked about this notion that, and I remember specifically one CMO saying, if you have too much spend, you don't have enough people to execute. And if you have too many people, you don't have enough budget to keep them busy. And so finding 100%. That balance, but feels like spending a third on tech just off the top, really? That's benchmark?
It's interesting. So that was what they said as of 2021 insights. But I think also the difference is like what you categorize, like who takes the CRM budget. Like CRM technology can be very expensive per user. And if you're looking at customer data platforms or anything else. So definitely the things add up. And the idea is that if you're spending on tech, then potentially you're capturing automation, which requires less people. It requires different types of people for sure. But that's, I think, the idea for sure is how you're actually executing and optimizing those programs. The more you can automate, the more you can invest in the data and technology. The idea is to kind of hopefully achieve scale. All right,
I'm going to challenge that for a second. Wait a second. Let's just say you have 25 technologies in your stack. How many do you actually think save you time and don't require enough people to take advantage of it?
No, I it was interesting to me as well, because I thought like the way we spend, it's like we are definitely not at that benchmark. But I was also thinking about like the chargeback, right? Like we use Microsoft 365, we use Dynamics CRM as people. So like what are the just baseline technology costs that it requires for a user to operate in the enterprise? work, not just like the marketing technology. So I wasn't sure where they kind of drew the line. It was really interesting. And obviously marketing just kind of gets charged back with us with how much we use maybe the CRM system. And there's definitely a lot of split costs. And I think this year it's interesting for us because we've been investing in customer data platforms and thinking about these things very differently. And so I think anytime you do that, you go through these kind of digital transformations, there's a heavier load on people, a heavier load and spend on technology or maybe even consulting to get it implemented the right way. And then you can kind of shift back towards programs. And what was interesting though over the past couple of years is the big ticket items that we also used to spend kind of all at once in one bucket. Obviously, we might show up to a massive conference and it wasn't just the conference, it was the swag, it was the giveaways, right. It was the travel. It was the brand awareness, trying to like lead up and let people know that we were going to be there. So now that was kind of taken off the board this last year. And so I think it's been interesting seeing how that's resulted in a lot more inefficient digital spend with a lot of people initially, just as we all were like competing in the same spaces and going after the same platforms or media providers. So it was interesting kind of seeing off the back of that, how that sort of had to shift our approaches across the board. And
I
really
totally.
Yeah.
And I think what a lot of folks, so it's funny because I remember back to Huddles right at 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, and some CMOs just walked back the event budgets, said back to the CFO and said, here, you do it, because they wanted to have less obligation for deliverables. And others kept it and put it into digital. And by last fall, digital fatigue was so real. Webinars weren't performing. Everything was down.
Well, that's why I almost hate categorizing things based on what are you going to spend by certain platforms? It's like, do you need to drive brand awareness? Like, what's the business goal, right? As you have a high growth targets, what is it? Do you need to drive awareness? Do you need to drive demand? Do you need to reduce your churn rates and focus on customer experience and customer success? And so I think that's really where the kind of rubber meets the road a little bit when we're kind of actually putting plans in place, especially at the regional level, and deciding what we're going to kind of take and own at the corporate level, and where we sort of start to have to draw those boundaries and lines. Because as we know, like brand awareness is typically going to be more expensive, and it's a really hard, very hard to prove ROI. So for that, it's about how many impressions do we need to drive? How much do we need to grow our website traffic by? So that the demand teams have something to convert into opportunities in the first place. What audiences do we need to go build? Anytime you're doing that,
I gotta stop you there because there's so much that I need to unpack.
I know.
And we have to move on and bring this back. But I do want to circle back at some point and just get to how we're spending that 1/3 of the money that isn't being spent on people in tech, but we'll come back to that. And so now we're going to move in and bring in Sue Holub, who is the CMO of OnSolve. Sue, how are you?
I'm well, Drew. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And where are you?
I am in Alpharetta, Georgia, which is just north of Atlanta.
Yeah, I know where it is. Yeah, I think many years ago we had some billboards there during the, a long time ago, the Atlanta Olympics. Okay. So one sentence on OnSolve.
Yeah, so OnSolve is a SaaS leader, so we're in the software space, and we help organizations mitigate physical threats and remain agile and resilient during a crisis is basically what we do. So think of it as an AI-powered SaaS platform that enables enterprises or SMB organizations or even government entities to detect and anticipate and mitigate those physical threats that we're hearing about, unfortunately, every day.
Okay, so we're in the land of cybersecurity. And so we know a primary target is going to be the security people, the CISO type, or CISO, however you pronounce that. But let's talk a little bit about your targeting priorities.
Yeah, so if you think about it, there's kind of two buckets. Think about kind of roles and maybe ideal customer profile. So from a roles perspective, we would look at personas like security, IT, risk, business continuity, disaster recovery, roles like that. And those can even roll up to certain C-suites like the COO. We're seeing CISOs, we're seeing chief risk officers now. So those kind of organizational roles. And then from company perspective, perspective, organization perspective, honestly, it's less about the type of company because we can service anybody from a university to, we have half the Fortune 100 to hospitals and healthcare organizations or government entities, city of, town of, state agencies. But it's more around large employee bases or geographically dispersed, frequent travelers, executive protection, employee safety, population alerting and warning during a tornado. Those are kind of the more common use cases, a lot during COVID and pandemic related communications for people to get vaccines are the kinds of things people come to us for.
Okay. So I am imagining that this is not an easy sell, that this is a long sales cycle and a lot of people are involved in the decision. So when you think about all of these targets that you just mentioned, how do you how do you set priorities? And maybe that'll help get to this conversation that we're having on marketing mix. What's your approach?
Yeah. Well, I think similar to everybody else, I'm a begin with the end in mind kind of person. So it depends what you're solving for, and that honestly changes over the life cycle of a company's growth. So for me, pipeline has always been king as a priority from a marketing perspective. And you could ask of your marketing function to do a lot of things, but at the end of the day, if it isn't driving sales, driving in software's case bookings, other companies' overall revenue, then it's kind of a nice to have, not a must have. So I always kind of begin with that end in mind and work back from the dollars. But other things that you look to the function to do are things like awareness. A lot of the things Amber talked about. We talked about awareness. It could be retention and churn. It could be engagement, customer engagement, or even things like referenceability. Can we drive NPS scores and customers recommending us to others as prospects in a sale? So those are a lot of the areas where we focus on as priorities. But for me, pipeline for sales to work is always number one.
So pipeline's our number one priority, but we have to drive pipeline. And with that's the language that you use. So talk about the marketing mix that gets to pipeline.
Sure. The challenge with marketing is it's always looked at as the potpourri function, right? It could be everything from I need swag and pens to please get me into enterprise level, 7-figure deals. And all of those things don't drive equal value. So when you start with what the priority is, so in our case, let's say it's pipeline, we focus first on what does organically have to happen. I will echo the sentiment that marketing operations and automation is very much underplayed. It doesn't get the hero welcome that it deserves. If you don't have the right systems and data in place, it's pretty hard to scale. And so I do think marketing automation and operations, which is costing more these days, just like all technology is a huge foundational element, along with digital and content. Those for me are kind of my three basis ones. And then you can scale up lots of different campaigns and programs and targeting and ad spend from there. But if you don't know how to ingest it and measure it and do those ROI calculations or that targeting, then it's a little bit more shotgun than rifle on something that you're trying to achieve.
And do you have a rule of thumb when it comes to budgeting of people and tech and technology? I mean, people, technology, and spend, on programs?
Yeah, I think so. You touched on it earlier. Everybody always talks about the perennial favorite of 50-50, and that's generally a good guardrail. I'll be honest with you. I haven't really put it to percentages, but I always over-index on people, which is not a common path. But I do that because I have found in my experience, and we've both been at this for decades, that if you can find the right shoulders to stand on, from an expertise and a team culture and a high performance perspective, then as budgets ebb and flow, and invariably they do, Drew, then you've got people who can make the most with what they have. I don't care if it's $20,000 or $2 million. In the hands of the right people, I found that you can really maximize the value. And so for me, I always index a little bit more on getting the right shoulders to stand on in the people department than on necessarily program dollars.
And of course, we know people are costing more right now, a lot more.
They are. They are indeed.
So I wonder in that part of this calculation is, of course, what you're doing in-house versus outsourcing. And, if you have a really large content team than I get, because content becomes the marketing that is driving the, your pipeline. So I get how you could spend more on people than you might on programs, for example. So do you have a really large content team?
It's interesting. I don't. So it depends on how you count a large content team. So one of the things I do whenever I join an organization, and I've been with OnSolve for years now, I joined in 2019, but I look at kind of what's in-house and what's out of house. And most of the time it's usually backwards. So I find, for example, my content team structure today, I have 2 dedicated full-time people in content and 1 kind of director of content and creative. And the rest of it is out of house. But you have to have that process and that kind of editorial checking process that brings the work in and out, packages it up, farms it out, gets it back, checks it for brand voice, talking about the product correctly, accuracy, etc. And if you can get that kind of content factory built, it's very scalable. So you don't have to in-house everybody. You don't have to out-of-house everybody. For me, I try and work in kind of blended hybrids, of maybe 1/3 in-house of whatever the capability is, digital content, what have you, and then the other 2/3 out-of-house.
And it's so interesting. And this, again, it makes this so challenging because there's so many different ways of doing this and trying to figure it out. What I really hear from you loud and clear is that at the center of this thing, the marketing ops thing is just so crucial even to have a conversation about marketing mix and sort of know what's going to work. You have to have this good, this good marketing operations team and technology in place. So I'm going to go to this other side, and I'm just going to say, so 45% of your budget is for programs. Last question for you before we move on is, how do you then, I know we say pipeline is king, but the 45% right now is being spent in sort of what kind of buckets? Just sort of broad-based.
So the lion's share of it is spent in content and what you think of as more traditional campaign level spend. Our number 1 lead source here is digital SEO, so organic. And you can't go buy more SEO, right? You achieve SEO, as we've all explained to our executive teams and boards many times. You have to. Your content is what is your leading indicator. Your SEO as a lead source is your lagging indicator. And so starting there, and then starting with other digital paid, we do events, trade shows, we do database marketing, email marketing, again, which goes through your marketing automation platform. The kind of your classic mix. And so social, paid social, strategic comms, things like that. So it's a pretty traditional mix, but the percentages are different across the board. We've shifted a lot from events because of COVID and tripled down on digital, and have found that that's been really successful for us. And that's where it brought the content piece along. So we're continuing forward with that and seeing the results. Just from 21 to 22, we've literally doubled the pipeline at the company across all sales teams.
That will bring smiles to the boardroom. So I love that.
It has. We want to keep optimizing that, but always looking to experiment and test new things too, like ABM. We put that in 21 as well. So it's never stagnant. It's never static.
Okay, we're going to move on, but we will be back. So let's welcome Suzanne Reed, CMO of LBMC and star of episode 22 of this show and episode 275 of Calling All Compelling Content. So, Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great to have you back. So, first of all, where are you?
I am in Nashville, Tennessee.
Wow. All right. Well, we've got 2 Southerners and a couple people across the pond. Okay. And so because we've been talking about LBMC in a couple shows. So is a service firm that provides accounting, advisory, auditing, and more, but it's a lot, right? And so I'm imagining that you, with all those services, you have a wide range of targets, right?
We do. I would say our targets, much like Sue and Mary talked about, we start kind of with that end in mind, but our targets are all, there's some similarities across our 7 companies. And so we look at that holistically, and we kind of start with that in mind, but it is basically the C-suite. It is the decision makers, all the way from the CISO, the CTO, the the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and even the CHRO or CPO, depending on how they're doing with their talent. So, our targets, we do everything from, as Sue talked about, cybersecurity to the traditional, I'm going to do your taxes. We also deal with high net wealth individuals where we have family offices where we're actually working with them, in their succession planning, their generational wealth planning. And so it is a lot. It is a lot. So to your point, talk about thinking about marketing mix and thinking about marketing budgets. It's very challenging.
Someone calling you for more advice on marketing mix. It
How
must have
about
been the
that?
kid.
Yeah, I never get
that's
phone calls.
exciting part of a live show. And having worked with large and actually medium-sized companies like yours, offices and partners are like fiefdoms. They tend to want they have their own solutions. They want their own support, that kind of thing. I'm wondering how that impacts your strategic priorities and marketing mix thinking.
Great question, because it could very much. And in many of the roles I've had, there's always that local level, and then there's the corporate level, if you will, and then there's my pet projects. The way we have kind of wrangled that at LBMC, and it has worked very well, is we have a strategic initiative each year discussion, and we really put a lot of emphasis on kind of that go to marketing strategic efforts. And that is where we really talk about we're going to put our spend, our time, our resources. And of course, you've always got a little bit of a set aside for that small local thing that you want to do. But for the majority of our marketing dollars, we look at it from a true go-to-marketing perspective and set up our budgets based on our initiatives that are tied to that. So examples, private equity is huge for us. We've got a go-to-marketing strategy around private equity. And so with that, then we determine what our marketing mix will be within that. And a little bit like Sue, I am very bullish on people and love to do, like to get the experts, the people up to a certain level so that they can understand the business well enough that they're able to really leverage their knowledge and the tools to get us much more for our dollars than we would get if we were just doing programmatic things one after another.
So since we've been talking about this question of people versus tech versus program spend, do you have a rule of thumb when you look at it?
I don't have a rule of thumb, but I have, if I look back at my numbers for the last couple of years and just kind of think in my head, I am probably about 50-50 when I come people programs, but I would tell you that is because my CRM expenses, while I own that system, they live in IT. And so I'm not being looked at for those 100%. So that's a positive. Even though I'm the decision maker and I am actually the system owner, those are considered IT expenses. I have a marketing ops team, but again, that's where I'm bullish on people to leverage that automation and leverage that knowledge and data. But I don't look at it from that perspective. We consider the CRM a core critical system. And so then again, I'm not having to fight those battles as far as those dollars consistently.
So those are sort of just spread out and they don't necessarily hit, it's okay, marketing, you're taking 100% of that, which makes sense because in theory, a CRM is the whole company, from acquisition to retention. So let's just take let's take private equity because you brought it up, or you pick another one and just talk about the marketing mix for that kind of program.
Absolutely. And so a lot of what it starts with, as many of the others have talked about, is content. I mean, content's king. It's what starts the conversation. It works with digital. It works with traditional email. It works with person to person. And we're doing all of those things. Big focus has been to be around really going right to those targets. And so we've done what we've called road shows. And so that's a little different. You might put that in a kind of a BD bucket technically, but we've put that in the marketing budget as we have a playbook. We create kind of a packaging and we go to market and we have, 4 or 5 of our leaders that come with us. and they will set up 16, 18 meetings in a 1 or 2 day period and meet with, give the LBMC story, talk about our services, and then we have a follow-up plan. And so that's a very targeted, very specific BD effort that we kind of include in our marketing mix. And then we will also follow that back up with campaigns that will be soft campaigns with content that will actually see if we get any engagement from that. And then from there, so the traditional kind of funnel things then kind of become engaged at that point. And then we're kind of look at the supporting elements of that. We'll do a little bit of brand ahead of that. If we're headed to New York, we might do a little bit of digital in the New York area in a pitch book, for a publication trade pub kind of perspective, and really get very targeted. And so I think Sue and Mary both also said it. My marketing mix changes dramatically. For private equity, very targeted, very bullish, very one-on-one. You go to one of my other segments, we get a little more mass, and we go back to some traditional print ads, sponsorship of a trade show that we might know that our decision makers are going to be at. If you think about the cybersecurity world, we show up in some of those security type events. We might also showcase a speaker or host some type of webinar. A lot of times my CPAs, accountants, tax people, I'm probably not going to do a lot of webinars with them. So again, my marketing mix switches up depending upon not only my target, but also my content providers, as well as what we've proven in the past to be effective lead generators or conversion tactics. And that's kind of how we position each of our programs and each of our marketing mixes for the go-to-market teams.
Okay. I've sort of one last question, because we haven't really talked about this as part of the marketing mix, and maybe we'll get to it after the gin tasting. But I'm just thinking, because as a firm that has so many different services, I got to imagine there's a land and expand in there too. And does that fall under your marketing prerogative?
It does. Again, based on our segments, we have what we would call cross servicing instead of cross sales, cross servicing. And an element of that is exactly what we call it, whether our shareholders bringing in a brand new client, or whether we have a business development person bringing them in, or whether they're current clients and we are just trying to cross service. A perfect example, during the COVID times when many people weren't out there, many of our efforts were around, here are some things that would be helpful to you as you're debating PPP dollars, or as you're debating, where your next growth efforts are going to be coming from, or how you want to, optimize tax, or if you're having to put in this new lease accounting rule. So we did quite a bit of what I would deem kind of that cross service, that expanding of that current relationship with soft selling. And then we would have our client partners who own the clients go back in with a follow-up of, how else might we help you? How's your business going? And kind of having those business conversations. So that's absolutely within our purview. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So at this moment in the show, I'm going to talk about CMO Huddles. And this is a program we launched in 2020. It's an invitation only peer community that brings together an elite group of CMOs to share, care, and dare each other to greatness. Seriously, that's what we do. One CMO described huddles as timely conversations with smart peers in a trusted environment, while another called it a cross between an expert workshop and a therapy session. So, Mary Leigh, Suzanne, you've all, you're pretty new to huddles, but that's not true. Suzanne, you've been with us a while. Anyone want to comment about their huddles experience? I'll give Suzanne, you've been at this for a bit. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Drew, I think you have created an environment that feels very safe, and that does have some stellar minds that people are very, very willing to share. In the timeliness, I'm amazed at when you just reach out and ask a simple question, how fast the respondents are willing to jump on, give you that information, and, kind of network. And not, you just don't get that in all of the groups that are out there.
That's awesome. I loved it. Thank you for sharing that. It's funny because we were talking about this yesterday in a huddle, and just the circle of trust that we've been able to build is really very gratifying. I know that, look, Mary Leigh, Sue, you're brand new to huddles, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that you want to share, if either of you want to share.
No, so far so good. So honestly, I'm also a relatively, I'll call, newly minted CMO. So only for the past year or so. So honestly, it's been incredible to get this level of resource just right, sort of as I'm embarking on my journey and prioritizing, and great to have minds to pick. I think I rely on some of my personal professional networks as well, people that my friends that are ahead of growth. And so it's nice to have those counterpoints of view. But I definitely, have a very technical background. And so I don't have a lot of that CMO in my kind of organic network, if you will. So honestly, this has been just really wonderful to be able to, as Suzanne said, just pick brains of really amazing and quite sharp people.
Awesome. Well, Sue, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything, feel free.
Yeah, definitely. And but the first thing I was going to say was, Mary Leigh, you'd never know that you're a newly minted CMO from your answers earlier. So good on you there. But I would say, it's very meat and potatoes. It's one of the most efficient meetings I've ever been a part of, and I love that. I mean, we deal with very specific topics. We provide each other very specific answers that are actionable. They're useful. They're helpful. And so there's a time and place for those kind of more ethereal, broad philosophical things. And that's great. But I've found the engagement so far to not only be very high energy, but just very actionable, very focused, usable information.
Love it. Okay. Well, we just happen to have some recorded comments from some other huddlers to play while we, the four of us, go grab our gin and your chilled glasses. So we'll be right back. Don't leave. We got a lot more marketing mix to talk about.
And I love the way that you're able to bring together experts and practitioners to share their experiences and to accelerate learning.
Just by listening, I've tripled my experience.
It's a great way to have these conversations with your peers.
Even if you miss, an actual live session, just the capture you guys do of the notes, the tidbits, the takeaways, just super valuable.
It's such a nice forum to be able to bond with other marketing leaders that are facing the same things that you are.
There's just so much goodness from the learnings and the dialogue and everything else.
So it's really nice to connect to peers that are B2B.
The Slack channel, I think, is amazing. There's just some really helpful ideas and thoughts and things being shared in there as a backstop underneath the huddle actual meetings.
Because of the format of the CMO Huddles, there's, maybe 10, 15 people on each of the sub-peer groups, which makes it really easy to build one-on-one relationships.
It's a community that I think I really needed right now, so thank you.
If you're a B2B CMO who can share, care, and dare with the best of them, ping me, Drew Neiser, on LinkedIn or apply at cmohuddles.com. All right, Melissa, welcome. Melissa is our producer and is going to walk us through the gin tasting.
Yes. Okay. So we have 2 gins today. Kind of fun because we're like half on the East Coast and half over in GMT time. So the first gin that we'll be trying is Bar Hill Tomcat Gin, which is made in Northeast Vermont. So go ahead and take that one. I'll tell you just a little bit about it as you have a sip of it.
Looks like. Yes. There's the bottle.
Yeah. And as you can see, it's actually brown. Gin is usually the clear gin, but this gin is made a bit differently. So it's distilled like a normal gin, but then it's aged in an American oak barrel for 6 months. And this gin in particular, they only say 2 of the botanicals that they use. One is juniper and one is raw honey. So Bar Hill, the 2 architects of the gin, one was a beekeeper and one was a distiller. So they have raw honey on their farm and they put it into the gin as they distill it. So go ahead and give it a taste. It's probably going to be more like a bourbon.
Yeah, as a bourbon fan, come on, this was not what you were expecting.
Yeah, so this is definitely uncharted territory for me. Nashville would be more my whiskey bourbon area, Kentucky, to be honest. The color's fantastic, though. I love the amber color, and I do think you can taste kind of the juniper, the honey, etc., coming through. So it tastes more like a gin bourbon.
Yeah,
if it could.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's a gateway drink to gin, I think.
There you go.
If you're not a gin drinker.
But what do you think? Mary Leigh?
I get the honey for sure. Like, I feel like that kind of like honey aftertaste is super strong. Really nice. Honestly, I'm probably when moving to the UK, I was very like gin, and I think I was definitely converted over the past many years.
Okay.
Yeah. So honestly, this is definitely exciting tasting, and yeah, it's beautiful and it smells wonderful and has that nice honey aftertaste to kind of like.
Yeah, I mean, it has no bite at all, right? It's incredibly smooth on the tongue.
That's what I was going to say. Very smooth and very warm when it goes down. It's really, nice feeling.
This, I have to tell you, this is the only gin my wife will drink. This is it. This is.
I'll send you Drew's famous mintini recipe that he makes with this. I'll send it after the show.
Okay, we're gonna taste Gin Lane 1751, right? Okay.
Yeah, so this is an Old Tom gin. It's made in England. So the architect of Gin Lane 1751 is an 8th generation London distiller. His name's Charles Maxwell, and his family has been in the gin business since the late 1600s. And the name is in reference to the British Gin Act of 1751. So like prior to 1751, there was a big gin craze and people were getting way too drunk in the streets. So the British government started curbing gin production and making it a lot harder. Yeah, making it a lot harder for unlicensed merchants and like small gin shops to be selling gin, which made it cleared the way for larger distillers and retailers, which is probably where we get like our biggest brands. But yeah, so this will embody a classic Victorian style gin, and it has quite a few more botanicals in it, including orange, lemon, star anise, and orris root. What do you think of this one?
Yeah, definitely more classic, but I was told earlier to maybe have an orange peel on hand to maybe like have a little garnish. So I feel like I want to maybe try that right now.
Yeah, don't have that. Yeah, it's more complex for sure. It's got a stronger bolder, a little bit spicier, complicated flavor profile. You can taste a lot more flavors in there.
Yeah.
Definitely. So we're going to actually have Nicole come on to talk about orris root, which I did not know about today. And it is such a fascinating botanical that's in the gin. So here's Nicole to let us know about orris root.
Hi, everyone.
Nicole.
So orris roots come from the iris flower, and it's usually developed for 3 to 5 years before the roots are harvested and peeled, and then they are left for as long as 5 years to dry before being ground into powder and distilled. And there are a lot of fun uses for orris. It is apparently used in magic rites for protection, in love potions, to stop gossip, and in Japan, it warns off evil spirits.
Amazing!
Can you get it on Amazon, Nicole? I might need to order a box of that.
There you go. Yeah. Well, you can buy ground orris root as a powder. Anyway, Nicole, thank you for joining us in that insight. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That's awesome. Well, all right, now you got to pick. Which is your favorite? The Bar Hill or the Gin Lane 1751? I can't see what
Bar Hill.
Bar Hill. Yeah, I'm going with the what is it? The gin bourbon gateway.
Yeah.
The honey gin.
That's funny.
That's nicely delicious on its own, but I really want to I'm very happy to put this other one with just like a little bit of soda and maybe like a citrus garnish and go to town. So I feel like it's more of that like summer cocktail versus that like sipping.
This is like, I think of Bar Hill as an after dinner drink.
I'm going to go with that like famous consulting answer. Like it depends.
All right, fine. All right. Well, Melissa, thank you for that. We're going to
Thanks,
get
everyone.
back to the marketing mixes now that we're done with the gin mixes. And I want to, we've talked about sort of the aiming of this spending ratio and things, but I want to get to how do you figure out when you're sort of overspent somewhere and what are the indications? Because I mean, you sort of get to this point where you've got, you know, you're making your numbers and you say, hey, we're fine. We're making our numbers. And what is it that you do? Sue, you mentioned experimentation, but how are you adjusting your marketing mix as you go along? What are some of the indicators?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is know what a reasonable ramp is. So, for example, like SEO, I think people think of it like some sort of light switch. ABM, somewhat similar, and you know they're not faucets and light switches. So, to even start to see sustainable results in something like an SEO or an ABM is a 6-month ramp. And so, if you kind of set realistic expectations, then you know when to start tinkering with levers, knobs, and dials. And so, I think knowing by tactic or by program what that reasonably would be, maybe, for example, if you're getting into a new persona segment, okay, it's going to take you longer to have the awareness and the engagement and the impact there than it is at a place you've been marketing to for 10 years. And so those kinds of things do matter. But once you've achieved those time frames, and obviously would love to hear from Mary Leigh and Suzanne on this, but if you're not seeing the ROI, start to scale it back or at least diagnose why. Start to do maybe different pocket tests of things and say, is it my content? Is it my subject line? Is it the wrong persona? Is it my offer that I attached to it is wrong? Is it I'm showing up with the wrong show? I mean, you've got to start creating science experiments, so to speak, to kind of diagnose and control the variables.
Okay, and I want to now follow up with that, and maybe Mary Leigh or Suzanne, you can sort of, so we're saying there's ROI, which assumes that there's some kind of attribution modeling, and that we've all talked about pipeline. So I'm curious, when you hear that word ROI, and we'll start with you, Mary Leigh, what are you looking at?
Yeah, so I want to look at, that's a loaded question. So ultimately you have to look at revenue, but especially when you're in a company where like sales cycles could be like 6 to 9 to 12 months, it's like, well, that's a little long to wait. So then what I'm doing is honestly keeping a really good eye on my funnels for each programs. And anytime we set up a campaign or a playbook, kind of set it up as campaign playbooks, if you will. I'll have my personas as part of that, the messaging that I'm going to kind of take them through and kind of that ideal journey. But honestly, the bias has to be towards action and getting something out there with a specific objective in mind. So persona objective. And then for that persona objective, are they hitting my website? Am I building that audience? Is my database of that kind of profile growing? And so I think if you have those kind of checkpoints along the point, then you can kind of like understand if you're doing a good or a bad job. Honestly, a lot of look back is going to be critical. It's kind of manual, but honestly, by looking back where the past stuff has come from, what's been most effective is always a great starting point. I think look back, unfortunately, can be very manual. We've seen this where maybe you have some data in CRM, some data in Marketo, some data this, that. So we've obviously invested in our data lake, but it's still kind of in its very nascent stages of rollout. So bringing together all the touch points is difficult. So you kind of do need to do a little bit of manual look back, or even that, you know, that extra question that everyone hates of how did you hear about us?
Right. And so you do, but that's first touch, right? Which is just one part of this thing. And then it's the whole, so ultimately what you get to is this weird numbers game, right? Of the, well, I did my job and I got the pipe full as much as I could, and then we got the opportunities, and then we got the demos and all those things. And I want to believe that there's more to it than that, but it might just be that. I'm curious, Suzanne, and then I'll come back to you two. When you want to, what drives a marketing mix change for you from a metrics standpoint?
Well, it's not an it depends answer, but it is depending on what we were trying to achieve on the out front. So not all of my metrics are that direct linkage to pipeline. Maybe we're getting engagement and then we're able to move them to the next level. But I think where we start to, we do a little bit of ABM. We're kind of playing with that. I think a few others said that too. So what we try to look for is movement forward and continuing engagement. And if we don't see that, and we almost take an attitude of, I don't know if anybody does lead scoring for their salespeople, but we have a little bit of that mentality of, all right, if they attended an event, they engaged with our content, we're going to give them, X points or whatever. And it's a little bit of that attitude with our attribution, if you will, with the ultimate goal being the pipeline. We like to say that, marketing can get them all the way to the pipeline, but we can't convert them from the pipeline on. That typically requires the end person, the end expert. And so for our world, it is very much about getting them to that pipeline. So we try to look at the pathing along the way in different ways. A little bit like Mary Leigh said also about the look back. We take a couple of really strong use cases each year of new clients we've brought on or clients we've landed and expanded, and look at where they were touched and what moved them down the path, and try to replicate if we can. And so that's another way for us to kind of get a feel for where we are as far as our current activities and where we might need to shift.
Okay.
It's a little bit of science and art.
Right. Mary Leigh, anything else to add on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is really interesting and kind of gets down to at a tactical field level where your best investments are in people and resources. And so I think we talked about one of the huddles, like what's a great pipeline buffer? Like, do you need 3X? Do you need 5X? And like 5X is a heck of a lot of pipeline to build if my guys are only going to close 20%. So, or my people, sorry. That's interesting because that also might mean that we might shift to more of that customer success centric things, or what are the more tactical workshopy things that we might do that are more hands-on to just improve that sort of buying experience later stage. If we feel like we have pipeline coverage, but we're maybe missing in the win rates, or, competition's getting a little fierce later in the sales cycle. So ultimately, I think to Sue's point earlier of having great people that can pivot and understand what the business needs to hit the territory targets, that's when ultimately marketers are going to be most effective, because we can say, look, we got you through X pipeline, but I see your win rates or your deal sizes aren't there. So how can we maybe help tactically there for this next quarter while we continue to do the things that are going to build longer term pipeline? That's when you need a flexible person that can be a little product marketer if you need to, or think about how to go build an audience from scratch.
So I am so looking forward to the next 6 months, 9 months of huddles where we actually solve this problem of 5X to 3X. We spent a super huddle on that, that really helped think this through, because having 5X coverage just means that 80% of the time your salespeople are failing. And then there's this whole,
leave the pipeline.
right,
Yeah.
right. It's just, they're just failing. And so that's a problem. And it sort of creates turnover, it creates all sorts of issues, but it means that really those weren't really the opportunities that we thought they were. So there's a qualifying issue. There's a time wasted issue, both on the marketing side, because what I'm imagining in my world, there's a 3X, because you're only dealing with the people that really are at the point where they're a genuine opportunity, and they really are. And so you didn't have to fill as many people in there. So marketing can spend more time doing what you were talking about, Mary Leigh, which is improve the win rate. And I think marketing can have an impact. But this is me on my high holy, but there's a wish list here. And I think it's an interesting one that we're going to solve this year through lots of other experimentations. Okay, this is the moment in the show where we ask, what would Ben Franklin say? And why do we ask that question? Because he was America's first chief marketing officer. He marketed a revolution to a king. That's a really hard challenge, and he succeeded. So what he would say is, in this context, which is better is a little content than much with contention. And that kind of speaks to what I was talking about a second ago, which is let's go with a little bit. Let's refine and try to get fewer better things. I think that's what he was saying, but I can't be sure because that was 2.5 centuries ago. Okay. So now we've zipped through this show. So let's talk about what role, if any, does your CFO play helping you with this marketing mix? Or is there another person, whether it's a CEO or a CRO, that really has their finger in it with you? And we'll start with Suzanne.
Yeah, so we do not have a CFO, but my group that I look to kind of bounce these things off of is we have shareholders who are responsible for individual practice lines. And then I also have 4 CEOs. So I'm going to the 4 CEOs of the companies, and I'm going to my segment line leaders within my one company. And so looking at that holistically, again, because I'm doing it by go-to-market, they are helpful because I've started with the end in mind, which is basically our financials. Where are we going to end up at the end of the year, and where is marketing going to play? What needles can we move versus where do we need to pull back and not do any activity this year? So no CFO.
Okay. No CFO. Okay. So Sue, I want to come back to this thing. You mentioned testing, and I wonder if you, like in my book, I talk about making sure that you have 10 to 20% of your budget allocated for testing. How are you approaching that specific aspect?
Well, for me, the most important role in my experience that's been, the tailwind in the sales for marketing is always the CEO. If your CMO is not aligned with your CEO, everything else is just a domino waiting to fall. And so when it comes to things like testing, to answer the specific question, it's the idea of saying, here's what we're doing that's tried and true. And so de-risking the concept of a pilot, which I call everything a pilot, is, why we're going to go ahead and try this. We're going to try this new tactic or this new investment or what have you. Here's why we're doing it. Here's what we think we'll get from it. Here's how we'll know. But the base business that you rely on the function for is in safe hands, right? So this should be accretive to that, or I'm taking out an underperforming investment and I'm slotting this one in. And so framing it in context for whoever the stakeholder is, a CRO, a CFO, et cetera. Our CFO doesn't get that involved in those kinds of things, just making sure I'm staying in my lane on budget and things like that. But definitely my CRO, because you'll get a lot of feedback from the field of, I got to be at this show, and you're trying to make those dollars stretch to, I want to try this new investment. Right. And you only have one pot. So that level of alignment among the CRO and the CEO always has to be there.
Got it. Okay. Mary Leigh.
Yeah, no, I like all great answers. I think where our CFO comes in is we definitely have a future end state in mind of actually getting to a point where you're like, with this investment, what's the return look like? And what's my ultimate model look like for inputs and outputs, which is everyone's desired golden state for sure. So they're a great kind of partner to think about how we ultimately get there. But I think to Sue and Suzanne's points, partnering with the CEO, staying on with the vision, and then partnering with the territory heads that kind of own those regional numbers to make sure that there is a sufficient plan to support them. But honestly, one of my best partners in a lot of this, and just helping weed out what is and isn't working and identifying what might be great testing opportunities, and then designing those tests so that it's true, statistically significant and relevant tests in as controlled as possible of an environment, is my analytics team and my kind of analytics officer. So I don't go anywhere without them. I'm a big proponent to internally sort of market them to other people, where if you're going to try something, if you don't involve them, you're trying it, not testing it. And that's not really useful. So.
Got it. Okay. Well, we're at this, we're very close to the hour, but I still want to get final words of wisdom from each of you, starting when it comes to optimizing your marketing mix. Suzanne, last words of wisdom.
Double down on what's working well and continue always evolving and testing.
Perfect. Okay. Sue.
Find the right shoulders to stand on. And while Suzanne said earlier, content is king, I think the collaboration is, rules the kingdom. So just making sure each of the teams in the function are moving forward in the same direction.
All right. I love it. Okay. So Mary Leigh.
Yeah, for me, it's all about kind of leaving opinions and thinks and whatever at the door and being open-minded to just have those controlled experiments and go double down on what's working, but being open-minded as far as what that could possibly be. And in high growth, you got to test again every couple of years and tweak it, because what worked then might not work again, and kind of always being open to what's next. For sure.
I love it. Okay, so there it is. You've got people, you've got testing, and you gotta keep trying, but go with what works and then experiment. All right. Well, thank you, Mary Leigh, Sue, and Suzanne. You are all wonderful sports. Thank you, audience, for staying with us. Please join us in 2 weeks when we will be talking about something fabulous, blending bigger and better B2B marketing with Peyush Dubey, Michelle Beebe, and Rebecca Stone. Cue the music. Renegade Marketers Live is produced by Melissa Caffrey. Our intern is Laura Parkin. Our botanical expert is Nicole Hernandez. For show notes, past episodes, and the latest on my new book, Renegade Marketing, 12 Steps to Building Unbeatable B2B Brands, visit renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those renegade thinking caps on and strong.